art friends, and welcome to the Learning to Rig in Harmony for Noobs tutorial thing. I'll be your host, Tracy Strong, and today we're going to be talking about pivots and pegs. Let's talk a little bit about setting up our pivot points. So right now, we are animating our drawing. Our controls are still on right here, and we can rotate the guy around here. Now if we want to set up a drawing pivot, one thing we can do is use the pivot drawing tool, and we can just click anywhere we want, boopy doopy doop, and now we can rotate around this new pivot point. This is how we used to rig back in the day when I started, and it's really convenient because if you're selecting on this drawing here, and you select your pivot point tool, so you can use your hotkeys J and H to cycle through all your drawings, and you can boop, next one, boop, next one, and back again. So we need in the center, center, center. It's very fast for setting up pivot point. Inside of our options box, under the transform tab, all the way down at the bottom you can see drawing pivot. Right now this says use embedded pivot. Apply embedded pivot on drawing layer. So what that means is that this pivot that we're using is going to apply to the drawing layer. The weird thing about drawing pivots is they're connected to the drawing substitution, not the drawing itself. So here we have our circle A, and now our star A is retaining the original pivot point that was set up for that A. We can put a new pivot point here, and now circle A and star A have two different pivot points. This can get a bit weird. You can see that it pops quite severely because they have different pivot points. If we want them to share exactly the same pivot point, what we would do is copy the drawing here. Instead of pasting, press Control B, and that will give us our paste special menu. And we talked a little bit about this when we were duplicating our drawing layers. So right now we don't need to duplicate anything. All we want to do is update the drawing pivot, press OK, and now these two items share a pivot point. So if we move this guy here, that guy there, so now we can do this. But if we wanted to change the pivot point here and the animation's already on, if we copy this and then paste it now, we're going to get some strange things happening because the thing is animated. We would actually need to extend our exposure, copy our drawings over here, and now I'm just using the drawing only tool. Here's the peg only, here's the drawing only. So I'm going to copy all of these drawings that I want to fix my pivot point on. I'll copy the first one that I know is working properly, select everything I want to add, paste special, Control B, update drawing pivot. So if you do happen to find yourself working on a production that's using drawing pivots, then that's how you would fix it if you have one that's wonky, or if you created a new drawing substitution and you didn't think to set that up in the first place. Since we already have our drawing pivots working, what we can do when we add our peg, so we can go into the options box here, and this is in the drawing options. Go down where we've applied the pivot on the drawing layer, and we're going to switch that to apply embedded pivot on the parent peg. So now you can see that when we animate on a peg, it turns yellow instead of purple. So if you're trying to remember if you're drawing with your orange outline or you're animating, if you're using pegs, you're going to get a yellow box instead of purple. And if you do have animation available on your drawings, it'll turn the box purple. So yellow box, purple box. You want to keep an eye out for that because sometimes these are set up a little sloppily and you'll have this checked. If you do have a rig where all of these are checked, what you can do is select all of them. You can Control A if you want to, but I have other stuff in the scene. And I'm going to use this multi-selection tool. Set properties on many layers. If you're using an older version of Harmony, there are tools, single tools for all these options. So you'd want to go to your animate using animation tools and turn that off for all of the drawings in your scene. Now, if we want these guys to also use the drawing pivots, we could actually set that up in here. Here you can see use embedded pivot, and that's exactly the same menu as in your options box. And we're going to set that to parent peg. So drawing would use the drawing pivot for that drawing if you're animating on the drawing itself. Parent peg is going to use the drawing pivot for the peg's animation pivot, and doesn't use the pivot that you've used created on this drawing. So for now we're going to set it to parent peg. You can see that I can cycle through all my substitutions, and it's using those pivots that we've set up properly. Now, again, if you happen to delete something to create a new drawing, let's say I need a different kind of star because I'm doing a twinkle of some kind. Now my drawing pivot's wrong. So then you'd have to copy this stuff. And you can just copy the one that's working. Copy, extend your exposure, paste, copy, Control B, update drawing pivot to fix it. So that little bit of an extra pain in the bum is why this is kind of fallen out of fashion. It isn't used that often. It is faster to set up for rigging. Like I said, you could just cycle through JJJ, and you can do that if you're using the drawing pivot on the peg, or if you're actually animating your drawings because you hate yourself. Now we're going to talk about peg pivots. I'm going to take all of these, use this option box. I have a choice. I can set the pivot on the drawing, and because our drawings are not set to animate, that's fine. It's the same as do not use, because the drawing itself can't be used, so its pivot's really irrelevant, and that's the default when you create a new drawing. Now our pegs are going to use the pegs pivot. And if I open up the peg option box, you can see it has a little bit less information than the drawing. Here's the drawing one, has this drawing pivot options box. Pegs don't have drawing pivot option boxes because they're not drawings. By default, it's just in the center of the default camera view. And if we want to offset it, what we would do is actually use one of these specialized animation tools and drag it over. So this makes rigging with pegs a little bit more time consuming because you have to select on each one and drag the pivot to where it wants to be. It also adds information to this pivot box. So here you can see that my pivot point is 3.23333 west and 0.444443 north. If you were to accidentally throw your pivot up like that, there's no way for you to get it back into place without undoing. So if one of your animators accidentally throws off a pivot, you'd actually have to open up the template of the character rig to see where the exact point of that pivot point was if you need it to be exactly where it was before. Sometimes you could get away with just eyeballing it depending on what you're actually doing, but if something's doing something very specific and the pivot point is more tedious, you might actually have to go into your template, which you're definitely not animating with. Your template is definitely saved into a folder and protected from your animators because animators break everything. There's the little downside to the peg pivot, and if I go into the drawing pivot, let me just backtrack for a little second. I can actually do the same thing with the drawing pivot. I can drag that down, and the pivot information for the drawing, in the exact same way as the peg, you can offset it from the drawing peg that you apply. So here I've set a center drawing peg, and then I could use one of these specialized animation tools to change where I want that to be. One thing to note is that if you're using the transform tool, which is like a combination of all of these tools combined, if I drag the pivot using this, you can see that there's a ghosted pivot remaining, and I can animate around this new point. But then when I deselect it and reselect, the pivot point has returned to its position that you've changed it to here. It uses that offset. So this is great if you need to animate a ball like this, as well as move your thing down and bounce it like this. Specialized animation tool, permanent move, boop, transform tool, temporary move. And you can see, try and remember that the little ghosty guy is there, and hopefully that'll help you remember when you're using which tool. Now, the next thing I want to talk about the pegs. If you open up your peg box, your transformation information is very similar to your drawing. You're going to get all the X, Y, Z, you're going to get the scale and stuff like that. But at the very top, well, there's Enable 3D, which again, this ain't DreamWorks, calm down. You can rotate things into 3 dimensions. So here my paper has been actually rotated. You can see it cutting through the B, and it's rendering out fairly civilized. Sometimes, depending on the complexity, that might not be the case. Keep that in mind. I've seen some really cool animation from some high-end guys using the 3D options. But for the most part, it's kept off, and you want to use it very sparingly because you can end up with all kinds of crazy stuff happening. Next thing I want to talk about is the position. The drawing tab has this as well. Position, 3D path, and separate. And most of the time things are set up to be separate. I'll show you why, but you'll run across animators who are like, 3D pegs are dumb and they should never be used, they're the worst. And I think the 3D peg gets a bad rep, okay? I really like the 3D peg, and I'll show you, there's advantages and disadvantages to both. Like anything, there's no right way, it's just the best way for the production that you have. I'm going to change the A to 3D, just so this is reading a little clearly. I'm going to change my B to S for separate. And I've got my 3D peg. I'm going to set this to 3D. You can see already something weird has happened, and that's because if you've already got a separate peg and you transform it into a 3D peg, it's going to try and jam the information into the new system, and sometimes it gets weird. So like I really caution you from changing this midway through an animation, because you're going to destroy everything you did. But if you're starting off scene or you're rigging something to begin with, then it's totally cool to play with that stuff. I'm going to just animate these guys up and then select them both and animate them down. You can see for the most part it looks like everything is working out as you would expect it. I'm going to turn on my spline tool. And here, my pivot point is lower, so the spline is lower because it's going from the pivot point. My 3D peg has an X. I'll zoom right in here, and it doesn't get very much bigger. But there's a tiny X on my 3D peg. And on my separate peg, you can see 3 different colors. And let me show you what's happening down here. So in your timeline view, in your 3D peg, you can see the position has been squat together to be one thing. So on our separate, we have the X, Y, Z are separate. And on our 3D peg, all of those are combined into one item. And this is the downside with the 3D peg. If you're animating a separate peg, you can change the velocity of each of these. You could ease in and ease out using your ease parameters on each of these separately, and that's why it's called separate. If you're using your 3D path, then you're limited in how you can ease. So for the most part, we use separate in production because it gives the animators the most utility and fine tuning that they can with these pegs. But here's where the 3D shines. If I take the separate and I move it out, you can see it's still tweening, but it's finding a direct path to where this new keyframe is. If we do the same thing on the 3D path, it'll automatically find a nice curve. If you need to do a bouncing ball, or say a box full of balls explodes and you need to draw 50 balls, then you would want to throw this 3D peg on there, and you can create a little extra peg if you needed to in production. Like say you're using this B and you've already got your separate peg, you create another one, and you could call this letter B 3D. And then anybody who's looking at this can see that there's an extra peg on there, and it might act a little strangely from what they're expecting. But it's good to know how the 3D peg works, because when you need it, if you need a curve, then trying to get a curve out of this guy is just a waste of time. If you need a magic carpet to just swoop through the scene like this, let me turn on my onion skin, then I can take this 3D path, and we'll pretend this circle is a magic carpet. Oh, let's not draw on the thing we're trying to move around. That's silly. So let me put this on the C first. Now, here we can take this and we can actually use the P, just the letter P, to add a point to this curve. I can add as many of these as I want, and it's not adding keyframes. All it's doing is really figuring out where that curve is. So now our 3D peg is just swooping along this curve. We've even got a little whoosh because our one keyframe is moved back a little bit. But you can't put any points at all on this one. It's just you can't add points. You can add more keyframes. So here I'm going to add a keyframe, and then here I'm going to add a keyframe, and I'm just going to end up, adding a whole pile, and then you can use those to create a nice curve. So I mean, it's obviously you're going to be able to get a curve with the separate path. It'll just take a little bit more work. But you can get that, like I said, you can get that really fine control, like, oh, I need to ease out on my X, but not on my Y. Then you have that ultimate control over where things are going. So most of the time you're going to be using separate, so keep that in mind. Know that there's going to be 3 X, Y, Z down here. It's also in the X sheet. You're going to have more options when we get into the complex stuff. So I'm just going to quickly select the peg, go up here to my little options box, edit, and share functions. So now if I go there in the X sheet, I have the X, Y, and Z all put out separately into the X sheet. So I could use those for other things once we get into the fancies of the program. In your 3D path, you can still share the functions, but you won't get the X, Y, and Z separately. So it's good to know that that exists and the difference between the two. It's good to know how to set up drawing pivots. Remember in here, all the way down the bottom. Don't use embedded pivot means that the pivot's not used at all. Apply embedded pivot on parent peg means it's going to tell the peg what to do. The drawing tells the peg what to do. Apply embedded pivot on drawing layer means that that pivot will apply to any animation that you put on the drawing, which we don't recommend, but it's good to know it's there and how to fix it if it gets broken. Okay, so that's it for the drawing pivots and pegs. In the next video, I think I'm going to add a video about some of the fancy modules in our node library. So that'll be up next. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the stuff we're going to be using in rigging. And then we will very soon get to rigging once we finish off our overview episodes. Thanks for dropping by. And if you have any questions or something was unclear, please leave comments in the comments. Please share this with anybody you think that could learn a little bit more about Harmony. Like and subscribe. All those things that internet people ask you to do. Thanks for dropping by, and I'll see you in the next video.